Nobody warned the courthouse that a 3-year-old girl was about to change everything. It was a cold, gray Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of October morning where the sky sits low and heavy, and the wind cuts through your jacket no matter how tightly you pull it closed. The leaves on the trees lining Mound Street had turned deep amber and rust red overnight, and they skittered across the courthouse steps in small, nervous clusters, as though even they could sense that something important was about to happen inside. The Franklin County Courthouse was already buzzing when the first attorneys arrived at 7:30. Security guards checked bags with extra attention. A bailiff rechecked the courtroom seating arrangement twice. Court reporters tested their equipment and then tested it again. In the small conference room on the second floor, Prosecutor Linda Marsh stood at the window with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, staring down at the street below, watching cars pull in and people walk briskly toward the entrance, and feeling something she rarely allowed herself to feel before a trial. Doubt. She had been a prosecutor for 15 years. She had tried cases involving hardened criminals, organized fraud, brutal violence cases that had demanded every ounce of her skill and resolve. She had won the majority of them. She had built a reputation in Franklin County as someone who did not back down and did not lose focus and did not let the weight of a difficult case crack her composure. But this morning, standing at that window with her cold coffee and her carefully organized case files, Linda Marsh was cracking. Because today's case was different. Today's most important witness was not a detective or a forensic specialist or a credible adult with a clear memory and the ability to articulate what they had seen. Today's key witness was a 3-year-old girl named Emma Rose Calloway, and Emma hadn't spoken a meaningful word in 11 days. Emma had arrived at the courthouse at 8:15, brought by her foster mother, a warm and patient woman named Diane who had fostered 14 children over the years and had never once stopped being moved by what they carried. Diane had dressed Emma carefully that morning, a white dress with small blue flowers, white tights, and shoes with tiny buckles that Emma had insisted on fastening herself, even though it had taken 4 minutes and resulted in one buckle slightly off-center. Emma had not let Diane fix it. That small stubbornness, that fierce insistence on doing it herself, was one of the few glimpses Diane ever got of the child Emma might have been before everything happened to her, before the thing that had brought them all to this courthouse on this cold October morning. They sat together on a wooden bench in the second-floor hallway, Emma and Diane and Emma's caseworker, a tired-eyed young woman named Patricia who checked her phone every 3 minutes without seeming to realize she was doing it. Emma sat between them with Benny the rabbit pressed flat against her chest, both arms wrapped around him, her small legs dangling several inches above the floor. She had not spoken since they left the house. She had not spoken in the car, even when Diane pointed out a dog running loose in someone's front yard and said, "Look, Emma, puppy." She had not spoken when they stopped for a red light beside a school bus full of children pressing their faces against the windows. She had not spoken in the elevator, or in the hallway, or when a kind bailiff crouched down to her level and offered her a wrapped candy from his pocket. She took the candy. She did not say thank you. She held it in her fist without unwrapping it and stared at a fixed point on the wall across from her. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Not from crying. Emma had not cried that morning. The redness was something older than this morning. It was the redness of someone who had done a great deal of crying in private, in the dark, in the particular loneliness of a child who doesn't yet have the words for what is hurting her. Down the hall, Linda Marsh was having an urgent conversation with Carol Simmons, Emma's guardian ad litem. Carol was a veteran of the child advocacy system, 22 years of navigating impossible situations with steady hands and a calm voice. If Carol was worried, things were genuinely dire. Carol was worried. "She hasn't responded to anything this morning," Carol said quietly. "Not to me, not to Diane, not to the psychologist. She sat through a full prep session yesterday and said 4 words total. 4 words, Linda, in 45 minutes. Linda pressed her fingers to her temple. What were the 4 words? Carol paused. "Benny needs water too." Linda closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and looked at Carol with the focused, clear expression she put on when she had made a decision and needed to act on it before she had time to second-guess herself. "I'm calling Prout," she said. Carol's eyebrows rose slightly. "The dog." "The dog." Carol was quiet for a half-second, the half-second of a person rapidly recalculating odds and outcomes. Then she nodded. "Do it." Linda pulled out her phone and sent the text. "Bring Justice now." She walked back down the hallway toward Emma while she waited, taking slow, deliberate steps, the way you approach something fragile that you cannot afford to startle. She stopped about 10 feet away and studied the little girl on the bench. Emma was small, genuinely, startlingly small, in the way that children sometimes are when you see them in adult spaces and the contrast hits you like a physical force. The courtroom down the hall had ceilings 20 feet high and a judge's bench built to project authority, and a witness stand designed for grown adults with grown adult voices. Emma would sit in that witness stand in roughly 45 minutes, and the chair would swallow her whole, and the microphone would need to be adjusted 3 times, and every single person in that room would be staring at her, 12 jurors, 2 attorneys, a judge, a gallery full of strangers, and a court reporter whose job it was to transcribe every word. And Emma had said 4 words in 45 minutes yesterday. Linda watched her and felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes that she never, ever allowed to become tears during working hours. She thought about the case file. She thought about what had been done to this child. She thought about the man sitting in the courtroom down the hall, flanked by his attorneys, waiting, and the way people like him counted on silence, depended on silence, were protected by silence. She thought about how silence was not going to happen today. She heard footsteps at the end of the hallway. She turned, and there was Officer Daniel Prout, broad-shouldered and unhurried, rounding the corner with his easy, measured stride. And beside him, matching his pace with effortless grace, wearing his blue vest with the gold badge catching the fluorescent light, was a golden retriever with warm, honey-colored eyes and ears that moved gently with each step. "Justice." Linda looked at the dog, then she looked at Emma. Emma's head had lifted from the rabbit. Her eyes, distant and red-rimmed and fixed on nothing all morning, were suddenly, sharply, completely focused. She was looking at justice the way children look at things that feel, in some wordless and immediate way, safe. Linda exhaled slowly. "Come on," she thought. "Come on, sweet girl, just one more time. Find it one more time." Down the hallway, Justice's tail made one long, slow sweep across the polished floor. And Emma Calloway, who had not spoken in 11 days, leaned forward on the bench. Officer Daniel Prout had learned, early in his career, that the most powerful thing a person could do in a crisis was slow down. Not stop, not freeze, just slow down deliberately, consciously, in direct defiance of every instinct screaming at you to hurry up and fix things and make the bad moment end faster. He had learned this lesson first as a patrol officer in the tense, unpredictable streets of South Columbus, where rushing into volatile situations had taught him, through painful trial and error, that speed rarely solved anything and almost always made things worse. He had learned it again, more gently but no less powerfully, the first morning he had walked into the courthouse with Justice beside him and watched what happened when a frightened person met a dog who refused to be in a hurry. So when he turned the corner into that second-floor hallway and saw the little girl on the bench, saw her red-rimmed eyes and her white-knuckled grip on the stuffed rabbit, and the specific, heartbreaking stillness of a child who has learned that the world is not safe, Daniel Prout did what he always did. He slowed down. He shortened his stride. He dropped his shoulders. He let his breathing settle into something long and even and quiet. And he kept his hand on Justice's leash with the loosest possible grip, because Justice didn't need guidance right now. Justice already knew exactly what this hallway needed from him. Justice had been born in Santa Rosa, California, on a Tuesday morning in late February, in a clean, warm whelping room at the Canine Companion's national headquarters. He was the third pup in a litter of 6, not the biggest, not the smallest, but from his very first days the one the staff noticed. Not because he was louder than the others, or more demanding, or more visibly energetic. They noticed him because of the opposite. While his litter mates tumbled and yipped and competed for position, Justice had a habit of going still and watching. Just watching, with those warm, already serious eyes, as though he was filing information away for later use. The program director, a woman named Catherine Walsh who had been placing service dogs for over 2 decades, had seen thousands of puppies come through that facility. She had learned to trust her instincts about which ones had something extra, something beyond trainability, beyond intelligence, beyond even temperament. She called it presence. Some dogs had it and most didn't, and no amount of training could manufacture it if it wasn't already there. Justice had it from the beginning. His formal training began at 8 weeks and would continue, in various forms, for nearly 2 years. In that time, he learned to navigate crowded, chaotic environments without losing his composure. He learned to respond to 43 distinct commands, including several that most service dogs were never taught. Among them, a command that meant be still and stay still no matter what happens around you, and another that translated in practice to move closer to the person who is hurting. He was trained in hospitals and courtrooms and schools and crisis centers. He was exposed to sudden loud noises, unexpected movements, strong smells, flashing lights, and the particular electricity of rooms where human beings were in distress. He never flinched, not once. Catherine Walsh personally supervised his final evaluation. It lasted 3 days and involved a series of increasingly difficult scenarios designed to test not just his training but his character. The thing underneath the training that would determine how he behaved when something unexpected happened, when the situation didn't match the script, when a frightened person did something unpredictable, and the dog had to decide in real time what to do. At the end of the 3 days, Catherine wrote one word in the evaluation summary under the heading Recommendation: Deploy. Justice had been assigned to the Franklin County Courthouse Facility Dog Program 18 months before the morning he turned that corner and saw Emma Calloway. He and Officer Pruitt had been paired deliberately, the program coordinators matching handlers and dogs the way good matchmakers work, looking not just at qualifications on paper, but at something harder to quantify. The way 2 personalities would fit together, whether the human strengths would complement the dog's instincts and vice versa. Pruitt and Justice had been a perfect match from their first day together. Pruitt was a man who understood patience the way some people understand music, naturally, deeply, as a language rather than a technique. He had never been the kind of officer who needed to dominate a room. He had never confused authority with volume. He was the kind of man who could sit in silence with a frightened person for 20 minutes without once making them feel like the silence needed to be filled. And that quality, rare in human beings and rarer still in law enforcement, made him exactly the right partner for a dog whose greatest gift was the willingness to simply be present. In their 18 months together, they had supported 63 court proceedings. They had sat beside assault survivors and abuse victims and grieving parents and traumatized children. They had been in rooms where the air was so thick with pain it felt physical. They had done their work quietly and consistently and without drama, and they had gone home at the end of each day, Justice to his kennel in Pruitt's spare bedroom, Pruitt to his kitchen table and his reheated dinner, without either of them making much of it. But Pruitt had begun to notice something in the past several months that he hadn't fully noticed before. Justice was changing. Not in any way that could be measured or documented. He was still the same dog, same calm, same responsiveness, same bottomless patience. But there was something in the way he moved through the courthouse now that hadn't been there at the beginning. A kind of settled authority, as though the building itself had become familiar to him not just as a physical space, but as a place with a purpose he understood and had claimed as his own. The courthouse staff had noticed it too. The security guards greeted Justice by name every morning. The clerk of courts kept a jar of his approved treats behind her desk. A senior judge who had initially questioned the entire facility dog program had been observed, on 3 separate occasions, crouching in the hallway to scratch Justice behind the ears before a difficult session. Nobody mentioned it out loud. It simply happened, the way things happen when something has quietly made itself essential. Pruitt slowed his steps as they approached the bench where Emma sat. He watched Justice without appearing to watch him, the peripheral, practiced attention of a handler who has learned that the dog usually knows more about what a moment needs than the human does. Justice's ears had shifted forward slightly when they first turned the corner. Not alert forward, not tense forward, just attentive, interested. The particular ear position that Prude had come to recognize as Justice saying, quietly, "I see them. I've got this." They stopped 6 feet from the bench. Prude crouched down, shrinking his considerable frame so that he was no longer a looming adult presence, just a man at eye level with a small child's world. Justice sat beside him without being asked, his tail making one slow, wide sweep across the polished floor. Not frantic wagging, nothing that could startle or overwhelm. Just one long, warm, unhurried movement that said, as clearly as anything said with words ever could, "I am here, I am safe, take your time." Emma stared at Justice. Justice looked back at her with those honey-colored eyes that held nothing, no urgency, no expectation, no pity, no agenda. Just warmth and patience and the particular quality of attention that very few living things are capable of sustaining. The kind that makes the person receiving it feel, for the first time in a long time, genuinely seen. For a long moment, nobody moved. The hallway held its breath. Diane, Emma's foster mother, sat perfectly still on the bench beside Emma, her hands folded in her lap, not touching, not speaking, understanding instinctively that this was not her moment to intervene. Carol Simmons stood 15 feet away with her arms folded and her eyes fixed on Emma with an expression of carefully controlled hope. Prosecutor Linda Marsh stood at the far end of the hallway, close enough to observe, far enough not to intrude, her cold coffee still forgotten in her hand. And Emma Calloway, who had not spoken in 11 days, who had sat in silence through prep sessions and therapy appointments and gentle, patient attempts by well-meaning adults to coax words out of a place where words had gone to hide. Emma leaned forward on the bench. She looked at Justice's ears. She looked at his paws. She looked at the gold badge on his blue vest. And then, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a very important decision, she slid off the bench and took her first step toward him. The first step Emma took toward Justice was small. Of course it was small. She was 3 years old and her legs were short and the polished courthouse floor was unfamiliar beneath her buckled shoes. But it wasn't the size of the step that made every adult in that hallway go completely still. It was the quality of it, the intention behind it. Because Emma Calloway, who had spent 11 days retreating from everything and everyone around her, was not retreating now. She was moving forward. Her second step was steadier than the first. Her third was steadier still. She kept her eyes fixed on Justice the entire time, not on Prude, not on the badge, not on the blue vest, just on the dog's warm, patient face, as though everything else in the hallway had dissolved and there was nothing left in the world except this golden creature sitting 6 feet away, watching her come toward him with the infinite, unhurried calm of something that had been waiting for her specifically. She stopped directly in front of him. Up close, Justice was bigger than he had looked from the bench. His head was level with Emma's chin when he sat, which meant that if he had chosen to, he could have looked her directly in the eyes. He didn't do that. He dropped his gaze slightly, a deliberate, trained gesture of deference that the program's behaviorists had spent months teaching him, because direct eye contact, even from a friendly dog, could feel threatening to a traumatized child. Instead, he looked at a point just below Emma's face, soft and still, and waited. Emma studied him for a long, serious moment. She looked at his nose, broad and black and faintly damp. She looked at his chest, the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, steady as a clock. She looked at his paws, large and golden and perfectly still against the polished floor. And then her eyes traveled upward slowly until they reached his ears. His ears were extraordinary, long and silky and the color of warm honey at their roots, lightening to almost cream at the tips. They lay against the sides of his head in soft, relaxed folds, moving almost imperceptibly with each breath he took. And there was something about them, something in their texture and their warmth, and the way the fluorescent hallway light caught the fine golden hairs, that seemed to reach across whatever distance still existed between the little girl and the dog. Emma reached out her right hand. She moved slowly, not with the grabbing urgency that young children sometimes have around animals, but with a gentleness that seemed too deliberate, too considered for a 3-year-old. As though some part of her understood without being told that this moment required care. Her fingers touched the tip of Justice's right ear. She held them there for 3 full seconds, feeling the silk of it, the warmth of it, the living softness of something that was neither stuffed nor plastic, nor any of the safe, inanimate things she had surrounded herself with for the past 11 days. Something real, something warm, something that breathed. Then she pulled her hand back slowly and looked at her own fingers, as though checking to confirm what they had just told her. And then Emma Calloway opened her mouth and spoke. "Your ears," she said softly, in a voice barely above a whisper but perfectly clear in the hushed hallway, "feel like velvet." It was the first complete sentence Emma had spoken in 11 days. 11 days of silence. 11 days of single words or no words at all. 11 days of therapists and caseworkers and well-meaning adults crouching to her level and asking careful, gentle questions and receiving nothing in return but that heartbreaking fixed stare or a slight tightening of her arms around Benny the rabbit. 11 days, and a dog's ear had ended it in 30 seconds. Behind Emma, Diane pressed both hands over her mouth and squeezed her eyes shut for a moment. Not crying, not yet, but holding something back that very much wanted to become crying. Carol Simmons, 15 feet down the hallway, unfolded her arms and took one slow, deliberate breath through her nose. Prosecutor Linda Marsh, at the far end of the hall, went so completely still that she might have been a photograph of herself. Officer Prout said nothing. He didn't move. He barely breathed. In 3 years of doing this work, he had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in a moment like this was acknowledge it, that the fastest way to make a fragile, newborn thing collapse was to shine too bright a light on it too soon. So he stayed crouched and stayed quiet and kept his eyes soft and his body loose and let the moment continue on its own terms. Justice, for his part, responded to Emma's touch and Emma's words in exactly the way he had been trained to respond, and exactly the way he would have responded even without the training, because the training had only ever been teaching him to trust what he already knew. He didn't lean into her hand. He didn't wag harder or whine or shift his weight with excitement. He simply remained exactly as he was, warm, still, present, and let Emma decide what happened next. Emma decided. She sat down. Right there on the courthouse floor, cross-legged, in her white dress with the blue flowers and her slightly off-center buckled shoes. She sat down in front of Justice as naturally as if she were settling onto a blanket in a familiar backyard, tucked Benny the rabbit into her lap, and looked up at the dog's face from this new, lower angle. Justice looked back at her. And something passed between them in that look. Something that the adults in the hallway could observe but not quite name. Something that existed in the particular frequency shared by creatures who have both, in their different ways, learned what it means to be frightened and to keep going anyway. Then Emma began to talk. She started with Benny. "His name is Benny," she told Justice, holding up the rabbit so the dog could see him properly. "He's a rabbit, but he doesn't hop anymore because his legs got soft. Diane says that's okay. She says soft is still good." Justice looked at Benny with what appeared to be genuine interest. His ears shifted forward slightly, that attentive tilt that made him look, to anyone watching, as though he was genuinely considering what was being said and finding it worthy of consideration. Emma seemed to notice. She lowered Benny back into her lap and smoothed his ears. "His ear got torn off once," she continued, in the serious, informational tone that young children use when they are sharing something they consider genuinely important. "Diane sewed it back on. You can see the thread. It's blue thread because that's what she had." She turned the rabbit slightly to show the repair as though presenting evidence. "I said blue was okay. Blue is a good color." She paused, looking at Justice. "Do you have a favorite color?" she asked. She waited, with complete sincerity, for an answer. Justice held her gaze and said nothing, which Emma appeared to accept as a valid and thoughtful response. "I think maybe gold," she told him generously, "because you're gold." She reached out and touched his ear again, more fully this time, running her small palm along the length of it with slow, careful strokes. Justice remained perfectly still. His breathing didn't change. His body didn't tense. He simply accepted her touch the way the ocean accepts a wave, as something entirely natural, entirely expected, entirely welcome. "I like your ears the best," Emma told him. "They're the softest part." She talked for 14 uninterrupted minutes. She told him about Mr. Buttons, the orange cat at Diane's house who slept on the radiator and didn't like to be held but sometimes sat near Emma's feet when she watched cartoons, which Emma had decided counted as friendship even if Mr. Buttons didn't know it yet. She told him that her favorite cartoon had a purple dinosaur in it, and that the dinosaur was nice but a little bit loud. She told him that she didn't like the courthouse because it smelled like paper and something else she couldn't name, and the lights were too bright, and everything was very tall. She told him she was a little bit scared. She said it simply, without drama, in the same matter-of-fact tone she had used to describe Benny's repaired ear. "I'm a little bit scared," she said, her hand still resting on his ear, "but your ears make it better." Down the hallway, Carol Simmons turned away for a moment and looked at the wall. Emma looked up at Justice's face. "Are you ever scared?" she asked him. Justice looked at her with those steady, warm eyes. "I don't think you are," Emma decided after a moment of careful consideration. "I think you're brave. I think that's your job, being brave so other people don't have to be." She patted his ear one more time, firmly, conclusively, the way you pat something when you have made up your mind about it. "Okay," she said quietly, not to Justice, not to anyone in particular, just to the air, the way people say it when they are finishing an internal conversation and arriving at a decision. "Just okay." Officer Prout looked up slowly and found Linda Marsh's eyes at the end of the hallway. Linda looked back at him. Neither of them spoke, neither of them needed to. Emma was still on the floor, her hand resting gently on Justice's ear, her stuffed rabbit in her lap, her slightly off-center buckle catching the light. She looked, for the first time since anyone in that building had met her, like a child who had found something solid to hold on to. Above her, Justice sat exactly as he had from the beginning, warm, still, patient, present. Waiting for whatever she needed next. Linda Marsh had not become one of Franklin County's most respected prosecutors by waiting for perfect conditions. She had learned, over 15 years of trying cases in rooms that never cooperated, and with witnesses who never behaved the way you rehearsed and against defense attorneys who were very good at their jobs and knew it. She had learned that the window between a good moment and a missed opportunity was almost always narrower than you expected. You saw the opening. You moved. You worried about the consequences later. She was moving now. She walked the length of the hallway with quick, quiet steps, stopping beside Carol Simmons and dropping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the bench where Emma still sat on the floor with Justice. "I want to file a motion," she said. "I want the dog on the stand with her." Carol turned to look at her, in the courtroom. Beside her at the witness stand, close enough that she can touch him. Linda's voice was calm and certain in the way it got when she had already done the internal argument and won. "We have 40 minutes before we're due in front of Judge Harmon. I need you with me on this." Carol was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Linda counted them, and then she said, "You know Foss is going to fight it." "Foss is going to fight it like his life depends on it," Linda agreed. "I need you with me anyway." Carol looked back at Emma on the floor, at the small hand resting on the golden ear, at the child who had just spent 14 minutes talking to a dog after 11 days of silence. She thought about every child she had ever sat beside in a courthouse hallway. She thought about every case she had watched fall apart because a frightened child couldn't find their voice in a room full of strangers. She thought about what it meant to have one chance to get something right. "I'm with you," she said. Linda filed the motion at 9:47 in the morning. It was 3 pages long, precisely written, and cited 4 separate legal precedents from 3 different states. She had drafted the core argument in 20 minutes, not because the motion was simple, but because she had been thinking about this possibility since the moment Emma's silence had first been reported to her, 3 weeks ago, and some part of her had been quietly building the case ever since. The central argument was straightforward. Emma Calloway was a vulnerable child witness whose ability to testify was directly and demonstrably impaired by trauma-induced anxiety. The presence of a certified courthouse facility dog had already proven, in the hallway that morning, that it could meaningfully reduce that anxiety and restore Emma's ability to communicate. Denying Emma access to that support during testimony was not a neutral act. It was an active barrier to the truth-finding process that the court existed to serve. She cited the 2011 Idaho case of State v. Dye, where a facility dog named Ellie had been permitted to accompany a child witness to the stand, and the subsequent appellate ruling that had upheld the trial court's discretion. She cited the 2019 New York case. She cited an Illinois ruling from 2021. She attached a 2-page affidavit from Dr. Renee Foster outlining the clinical basis for animal-assisted testimony support. She attached Officer Pruitt's credentials and Justice's full certification documentation. Then she walked the motion down to Gerald Foss's temporary office on the 3rd floor and slid it under his door. She checked her watch. 31 minutes until Judge Harmon's courtroom. Gerald Foss read the motion in 8 minutes. He read it the way he read everything, completely precisely, with a yellow highlighter moving steadily through the text and a pen making small, tight notes in the margins. By the time he reached the final page, his highlighter had marked 7 passages, and his pen had produced 11 margin notes, and his jaw had the particular set it got when he was genuinely, seriously angry about something. Foss was not a man who became genuinely angry often. He was too disciplined for that, too experienced, too committed to the principle that emotion was a liability in a courtroom and should be managed accordingly. But this motion made him angry, not because it was frivolous, which would have been easy to dismiss, but because it wasn't. It was well constructed and intelligently argued and cited real precedent. And the thing that made him angry was that he knew, reading it, that it had a real chance of succeeding. And if it succeeded, his client was in serious trouble. He picked up his pen and began drafting his response. He wrote for 22 minutes without stopping, and by the time he was done, he had produced 11 pages of tightly argued opposition. He covered emotional prejudice extensively, citing research on how the presence of animals affected human emotional responses, and arguing that no juror, regardless of instruction, could look at a 3-year-old girl and a golden retriever sitting together at a witness stand and maintain the kind of rational, evidence-based evaluation that a fair trial required. He argued that the accommodation was disproportionate, that less emotionally loaded alternatives existed, such as closed-circuit testimony or a privacy screen, that could protect Emma without potentially tainting the jury. He used the phrase, fundamentally incompatible with due process, twice. He was not wrong about the emotional power of the image. He knew it. Linda knew it. Everyone who would be in that courtroom knew it. The only question that mattered now, was whether that emotional power was a bug or a feature, whether it was prejudice or truth. That was the question Judge Patricia Harmon was going to have to answer. Judge Harmon's chambers were on the 4th floor, at the end of a corridor lined with framed photographs of previous Franklin County judges dating back to 1887. The carpet was deep burgundy and slightly worn in the center where generations of anxious attorneys had walked it. The chambers themselves were large and deliberately understated. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, a wide mahogany desk, 2 chairs positioned across from it that were comfortable enough to sit in but not comfortable enough to relax in. That was intentional. Judge Harmon was 61 years old and had been on the bench for 15 years. And in that time she had developed a reputation for 3 things: absolute fairness, complete impartiality, and an almost preternatural ability to identify when someone in her courtroom was performing and when they were telling the truth. Attorneys who appeared before her regularly described the experience with variations of the same metaphor. She looked at you like she could see through you, and not in a threatening way, but in a way that made lying feel not just wrong but somehow physically impossible. She read both filings in silence, while Linda and Gerald sat across from her desk. The room was very quiet. A clock on the bookshelf measured the silence in small, even increments. Linda kept her hands still in her lap. Gerald kept his eyes on a fixed point above the judge's left shoulder, a technique he used to project confidence without appearing confrontational. Judge Harmon finished reading. She set both documents down, aligned them precisely with the edge of her desk blotter, and removed her reading glasses. She looked at Gerald Foss. "You argue that the image of the dog and the child will be inherently prejudicial to the jury," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Honor, regardless of any instruction the court provides." "And you believe," she continued, "that a juror cannot look at that image and still evaluate the evidence rationally?" "That is my position." Judge Harmon nodded slowly, then she looked at Linda. "And you argue that without this accommodation, the witness cannot effectively testify?" "Based on everything we observed this morning, Your Honor, and Dr. Foster's clinical assessment, yes, that is our position." The judge was quiet for a moment. Then she did the thing that both attorneys had learned to brace for. She set down her pen, folded her hands on the desk, and asked the question that was underneath all the legal arguments, the question that the legal arguments were really about. "Mr. Foss," she said quietly, "what happens to that little girl if she sits in that witness chair alone?" The clock marked 3 seconds of silence. Gerald Foss adjusted the cuff of his jacket. He was a meticulous man and a principled one, and whatever else he was not a liar, not in this room, not in front of this judge, not when the question was asked in that particular tone of voice that made the truth feel like the only available option. "She probably won't speak," he said. Judge Harmon held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked down at her desk. "I'll have a ruling at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," she said. "You're both excused." They stood. They gathered their files. They walked out of the chambers and down the corridor lined with the photographs of all the judges who had come before, and neither of them said a single word to the other. Behind them in her chambers, Judge Patricia Harmon sat alone at her wide mahogany desk and thought about a 3-year-old girl on a courthouse floor, talking to a golden dog about a rabbit with a repaired ear and blue stitching. She thought for a long time. The clock kept measuring the silence. Judge Patricia Harmon did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual for her. She had never been a particularly good sleeper, even before 15 years on the bench had given her a catalog of difficult decisions to replay in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. But this night was different from the ordinary restlessness. This night she lay in the dark of her bedroom in her house on the east side of Columbus and stared at the ceiling and turned the question over and over in her mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, examining each face of it, looking for the one that catches the light correctly. She had been a judge long enough to know that the law was not always the same thing as justice. That was not a cynical observation. It was simply a true one, the kind of truth that the law itself acknowledged in the very existence of judicial discretion. Judges were not computers. They were not meant to be. The legislature wrote the statutes and the appellate courts drew the boundaries, but inside those boundaries there existed a space, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow, always consequential, where a judge was required to make a human decision, to look at the specific, unrepeatable facts of a specific, unrepeatable situation and decide what was right. Judge Harmon had never taken that responsibility lightly. She got up at 5:15, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with the 2 filings spread out in front of her and a yellow legal pad beside them. She read Gerald Foss's opposition brief one more time, beginning to end, giving it the same careful attention she had given it in chambers. She had not dismissed his arguments then, and she did not dismiss them now. They were good arguments, made by a good attorney in service of a principle, the right to a fair trial, that she had spent 15 years defending with equal commitment regardless of which side of the courtroom it came from. She underlined 3 passages. She wrote 2 notes in the margin. Then she turned to Linda Marsh's motion and read it again. She spent a long time on Dr. Foster's affidavit. The clinical language was precise and carefully hedged in the way academic language always was, but underneath the hedging the point was clear. Children who had experienced trauma processed the expectations of adults around them as threat signals, triggering the same neurological fear response as the original traumatic event. The presence of a facility animal interrupted that cycle not by eliminating the fear, but by providing a sensory anchor, something warm, living, and entirely without agenda, that allowed the child's nervous system to regulate enough to function. In plain language, Emma could talk to Justice because Justice wasn't asking her for anything. Every adult in that courthouse was asking her for something. The prosecutor needed her testimony. The caseworker needed her to be okay. The therapist needed her to open up. The foster mother needed her to heal. Even the bailiff who had offered her candy had been asking for something, a response, a connection, a sign that the effort was reaching her. Justice had asked for nothing, and Emma had given him everything. Judge Harmon set down the affidavit and picked up her pen. She arrived at the courthouse at 7:30, 90 minutes before the 9 o'clock session. She went directly to her chambers, bypassing the usual morning exchanges with clerks and bailiffs, and sat at her desk with her legal pad and the accumulated weight of everything she had read and thought and turned over in the sleepless hours. She wrote for 40 minutes. Not the ruling itself. That would be delivered orally from the bench, as was her practice for contested motions. What she wrote was the argument she needed to make to herself, the internal brief that every conscientious judge constructs before a difficult decision, laying out every consideration in plain language, and forcing herself to confront the ones she found uncomfortable as well as the ones that supported the conclusion she was already leaning toward. She wrote about Gerald Foss's prejudice argument. She wrote about it seriously and at length because it deserved that, because he was right that the image of a small girl and a golden dog would be powerful and that powerful images affected juries. She acknowledged it fully. She did not minimize it. Then she wrote a single question beneath it. Is the power of that image prejudice, or is it truth? She sat with that question for a long time. A prejudicial image, in the legal sense, was one that provoked an emotional response disproportionate to its actual evidentiary value, that made a jury feel something that the evidence didn't warrant. A dog sitting beside a child at a witness stand was not evidence of guilt. It was an accommodation. The question was whether the accommodation itself, by virtue of its visual power, created an impression that went beyond accommodation and became argument. Foss said yes, that was his case. But Judge Harmon kept returning to something that wasn't in either filing, something that existed only in the memory of what she had been told about a courthouse hallway and a little girl on the floor and 14 minutes of conversation that had broken 11 days of silence. The dog hadn't created Emma's ability to speak. It had revealed it. The voice was already there. The truth was already there. Everything Emma needed to say was already inside her. The facility dog wasn't manufacturing testimony. It was simply creating the conditions in which testimony that already existed could come out. That was not prejudice. That was accommodation in the truest sense of the word. Judge Harmon put down her pen. She knew what she was going to do. The courtroom filled quickly that morning. Word had traveled, the way it always traveled in courthouses, through the particular osmosis of shared spaces and overheard conversations, and the instinct of people who work in buildings where important things happen to recognize when something important is about to happen again. The gallery was fuller than it had been the previous day. 3 rows of seats that had been empty yesterday were occupied this morning by people who had found reasons to be in this particular courtroom at this particular time. Reporters occupied the back row in a line, notebooks open, pens ready. 2 of them were from outlets that covered legal affairs specifically, one from a Columbus paper, one from a statewide legal journal. They had both been tipped off about the motion the previous afternoon, and both had spent the evening researching facility dog programs and courthouse animal policy and the handful of precedent cases that Linda Marsh had cited in her filing. Child welfare advocates stood along the right wall. Several of them had driven from other counties. One woman had come from Cincinnati, a 4-hour round trip, because she ran a courthouse dog program there and had been following the Columbus case with intense, professional interest. She stood with her arms folded and her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes were quick and alert, and she had not stopped moving her weight from foot to foot since she arrived. The jury filed in at 8:58. Several of them looked around the courtroom as they took their seats, noticing the fuller gallery, sensing the charged quality of the air. Juror number 4, a retired engineer named Howard, leaned slightly toward the woman beside him and murmured something. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. They both straightened and looked forward. At 9 o'clock precisely, the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Harmon entered. She moved to her seat with the same measured, unhurried authority she brought to every session, not hurrying, not performing, simply occupying the space with the kind of presence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what your role requires of you. She sat. She arranged the documents in front of her. She looked out across the courtroom. The silence was absolute. She began. She acknowledged Gerald Foss's opposition brief first, and she did it with genuine respect, not the performative courtesy of a judge dismissing an argument before overruling it, but the real acknowledgement of someone who had spent a sleepless night taking the argument seriously. She said that the concern about emotional prejudice was legitimate, that it had been raised responsibly, and that it had been given full and careful consideration. Then she turned to the precedents. She discussed the Idaho case with precision, noting both its relevance and its limitations. She addressed the New York appellate ruling and what it had established about trial court discretion. She cited Ohio's statutory framework for vulnerable witness accommodations and walked through the specific provisions that applied to child witnesses whose ability to testify was impaired by documented trauma. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes. The courtroom did not move. And then Judge Patricia Harmon looked up from the documents in front of her, looked out across the silent room, and delivered the 4 words that every person in that gallery had come to hear. The motion is granted. The room exhaled. Not loudly, there were no gasps, no audible reactions, no dramatic outbursts. Just a single, collective, almost inaudible release of held breath that moved through the gallery like a wave and was gone before it could be properly described. Several people closed their eyes briefly. The woman from Cincinnati stopped shifting her weight. Howard, the retired engineer, looked at his hands. Judge Harmon continued without pause, laying out the specific conditions of the ruling in precise, careful language. Justice would remain on the floor beside the witness chair. Officer Pruitt would hold his leash from a position behind the stand. The jury would receive a specific instruction clarifying that the dog's presence was a procedural accommodation and not evidence of any kind. No mention of the arrangement would be made in opening statements. Gerald Foss rose and renewed his objection for the record. His voice was controlled and professional and carried no trace of the anger that Linda Marsh, watching him carefully, suspected he was managing somewhere below the surface. Judge Harmon acknowledged the objection without looking up and noted it in the record. Then she set down her papers, looked at both attorneys and said simply, "We proceed at 1 o'clock. Court is in recess." She rose. The room rose with her. She walked back through the door behind the bench and it closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. Linda Marsh sat down slowly in her chair and looked at the legal pad in front of her. She picked up her pen. She wrote 3 words and drew a circle around them so firmly that the pen nearly tore the paper. Then she set the pen down, pressed both palms flat on the table, and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something that felt, quietly and privately, like hope. Across the aisle, Gerald Foss was already on his phone. The clock on the courtroom wall read 9:17. In 4 hours, Emma Calloway was going to walk into this room. The courtroom felt different at 1 o'clock. It was the same room it had been that morning, same high ceilings, same polished wood, same fluorescent light falling in even rectangles across the gallery benches. Nothing had been moved, nothing had been rearranged, and yet something in the atmosphere had shifted in the hours between Judge Harmon's ruling and the afternoon session, the way the air shifts before a storm, not visibly, not measurably, but unmistakably, in a way that the body registers before the mind catches up. Every seat in the gallery was taken. The reporters in the back row had been joined by 2 more. The child welfare advocates who had lined the right wall that morning had returned and brought others with them. Court staff who had no official reason to be present had found unofficial reasons. A clerk reviewing a file at the side table, a bailiff lingering near the door, a stenographer from another courtroom who had slipped in during the lunch recess and taken a standing position near the back wall. They had all come for the same reason, though none of them would have said it quite that way. They had come because word had traveled, the way word always travels in courthouses, and what the word said was this: something was about to happen in courtroom 7 that you would want to have witnessed. Officer Daniel Prout arrived at 12:20. He came in through the side door, Justice walking quietly beside him, and he did something he always did when preparing a space for a vulnerable witness. He walked the dog through it first. Slowly, methodically, along the perimeter of the room, past the gallery benches, past the jury box, past the clerk's table and the attorney's tables and the court reporter's station. He let Justice take in the smells and the sounds and the particular quality of the space, so that by the time the witness arrived the dog would be settled, not adjusting, not orienting, but already at home. Justice moved through the room with his characteristic calm. He paused briefly at the jury box railing, not because anything alarmed him, but because he was thorough, and thoroughness was part of how he worked. He sniffed the air near the witness stand. He looked up at the high windows where afternoon light came in at a long diagonal angle and fell in warm strips across the floor. Then he turned, walked to the witness chair, and lay down beside it with his chin on his front paws. He looked to everyone watching, as though he had always been there. As though the witness chair had always had this, a warm golden presence at its foot, patient and steady and entirely without agenda. Juror Barbara Hollies, a retired schoolteacher in the second row, watched Justice settle and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. She had been a juror 3 times before this. She understood her role. She understood the importance of objectivity and the weight of the responsibility and the necessity of evaluating evidence on its merits rather than her emotions. She was a serious, conscientious woman who took the obligation of jury service genuinely seriously. And yet, watching that dog lie down beside the witness chair, she felt something that bypassed all of that, something quiet and certain and almost physical, like a hand pressing gently against her sternum. She looked at the empty chair above him. She thought about who was going to sit in it. She folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead and did not speak. At 1:17, the side door opened again. Everyone in the room knew this was the moment, even before they could see who was coming through the door, because the bailiff near the entrance straightened almost imperceptibly, and the court reporter's hands settled on her keys, and the particular quality of the room's silence deepened by one more degree into something that was no longer just quiet but held. Emma came through the door. She was still wearing the white dress with the blue flowers. The yellow ribbon was still in her hair, slightly looser than it had been that morning, the natural entropy of a child's hair over the course of a long and difficult day. She held Benny the rabbit in her left hand, his soft body pressed against her hip. Her right hand was wrapped loosely around Officer Prout's fingers, not gripping, not clinging, just resting there, the way you keep a hand on a railing when you're not sure of the footing but you're moving forward anyway. She walked with her eyes down for the first 3 steps into the room. Then she looked up. She saw Justice. The change in her was immediate and visible and undeniable, a shift that moved through her small body from her feet to her face in a single, continuous wave, like watching a light come on in a window at dusk. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Her grip on Benny loosened. The fine tension around her eyes, the particular tightness that had been there all morning, that Linda Marsh had been watching with barely concealed anxiety since 7:15, released itself quietly and was gone. She let go of Prout's hand. Not because anyone told her to. Not because she had been coached or prepared or instructed. She let go because she saw where she was going and she knew she could get there herself. And the simple human dignity of that, a 3-year-old child choosing to walk into the hardest room of her short life entirely under her own power, made 3 separate people in the gallery look away for a moment because it was almost too much to witness directly. She walked to the witness stand. 12 steps across a courtroom floor that felt, to everyone watching, like the longest 12 steps they had ever seen a person take. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. She walked with the careful, deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided something and is now carrying the decision forward one step at a time, which is, when you think about it, the only way any decision ever gets carried anywhere. She reached the witness chair. She climbed up into it. It required a small, effortful scramble that produced the only sound in the room for several seconds, the soft sound of a child getting herself situated. And when she was settled, she reached down without looking, the way you reach for something you trust absolutely, and placed her small hand on Justice's back. Justice did not move. He absorbed her touch with the same perfect stillness he had maintained since lying down, and beneath her hand Emma felt what she had felt in the hallway that morning, warmth and solidity, and the steady rhythm of breathing that belonged to something alive and calm and entirely, unconditionally present. She looked up at the courtroom. The room had gone beyond quiet. It had entered a register of silence that has no precise word in the English language. The silence not of absence but of suspension, of a room full of breathing human beings collectively holding something back, some sound or movement or reaction that wanted to exist, but understood, without being told, that existing right now would break the thing it wanted to honor. Jurors who had been holding pens set them down. The court reporter's fingers hovered above her keys without touching them. 2 reporters in the back row had stopped writing. Gerald Foss, who had constructed 11 pages of argument against this exact moment, sat back in his chair with his hands flat on the table and looked at the small girl in the witness stand with an expression that was not readable from across the room, but was not notably the expression of a man who was confident he had been right. Linda Marsh stepped forward. She moved slowly, deliberately, projecting the same careful calm she had been projecting all day. The calm of someone who understood that the room was balanced on something fragile and that her job right now was to add as little weight as possible. "Hi, Emma," she said. Her voice was gentle and even and entirely normal, the voice of a woman greeting a child she had met before, not a prosecutor addressing a witness in a high-stakes trial. She had practiced this, the ordinariness of it, because she understood that the worst thing she could do right now was make Emma feel the weight of the room. Emma looked at her. "Hi," she said. One word, but the word landed in that suspended silence like a stone dropped in still water, clean and clear and spreading outward in rings that reached every corner of the room, because the word was not whispered. It was not hesitant. It was not the fragile, barely there sound of a frightened child testing whether it was safe to speak. It was just a voice, Emma's voice, present and clear and real. Linda took a small breath. "Can you tell me your name?" Emma looked at her steadily. Her hand rested on Justice's back. His breathing rose and fell beneath her palm in its long, even rhythm. "Emma Rose Calloway," she said. 3 words, 4 syllables each carrying the same clarity as the first, landing in the room with the same quiet, almost physical force. A juror in the 3rd row, a middle-aged man named Thomas who had barely shown any expression in 3 days of voir dire and opening statements, pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. What followed was 18 minutes. 18 minutes of questions asked gently and answered clearly. 18 minutes of a 3-year-old girl sitting in an adult witness chair with her hand on a golden dog's back and her stuffed rabbit in her lap, and her voice, her small, clear, extraordinary voice, filling a courtroom that had been bracing, collectively, for silence. She did not freeze. She did not retreat. She did not return to the wordless distance that had swallowed her for 11 days. She answered every question Linda asked her, and she answered them with the particular, unvarnished directness of a young child who has not yet learned to hedge or qualify or shape the truth to fit what she thinks the listener wants to hear. Children, when they speak, speak plainly. Emma spoke plainly, and every plain word she said was a world. Through all 18 minutes, Justice lay perfectly still at her feet. He did not shift or yawn or look away. He simply remained warm, present, breathing, and Emma's hand remained on his back, and the contact between them was the quiet center around which everything else in that courtroom turned. When Linda finally said, "No further questions," She stepped back from the podium and returned to her table and sat down and kept her face very carefully composed, because composure was what the moment required, and she was a professional, and professionals did not cry in courtrooms. She looked at her legal pad. The 3 circled words from that morning looked back at her. "We have a chance." She drew a single line through them and wrote 2 words beneath. "We did." Across the aisle, Gerald Foss looked at his notepad for a long moment. Then he looked at Emma, still sitting in the witness chair with her hand on Justice's back, looking back at the courtroom with calm, clear eyes. He gathered himself, he straightened his jacket, he opened his mouth. "No cross-examination," he said. 3 words that told everyone in the room, more clearly than 11 pages of legal argument ever could, exactly what Gerald Foss thought of what he had just witnessed. The courtroom held its breath one final time. Then Judge Harmon's voice came down from the bench, even and measured, and carrying the particular authority of someone who understands that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply continue. "The witness is excused." Emma climbed down from the chair. She paused at the bottom and looked down at Justice one last time. She placed her hand on his ear, just for a moment, just one final touch, and then she straightened up and turned toward the side door where Diane was waiting. She walked out of the courtroom the same way she had walked in. On her own, under her own power, one step at a time, the jury deliberated for 2 days. Not because the evidence was unclear, not because Emma's testimony had left them uncertain or confused or unconvinced. The 2 days were something else entirely. The deliberate, responsible exercise of 12 people who understood the weight of what they were being asked to decide and refused to treat it as anything less than what it was. They asked questions. They reviewed transcripts. They sat with the evidence in the careful, unhurried way that the system, at its best, is designed to produce. But from the moment they filed into the deliberation room on Wednesday afternoon, every one of them already knew. They knew the way you know things that settle in the body before they reach the mind, in the chest, behind the sternum, in that quiet interior place where certainty lives before it becomes language. They had sat in that courtroom for 3 days. They had listened to forensic testimony and expert witnesses and procedural arguments that washed over them with varying degrees of comprehension. And then they had watched a 3-year-old girl walk 12 steps across a courtroom floor and place her hand on a golden dog's back and speak. And after that, everything else had been secondary. Juror Barbara Hollies, the retired schoolteacher from the second row, was elected foreperson on the first ballot. She accepted the role with the same quiet seriousness she had brought to every aspect of her jury service. No drama, no performance, just the steady acceptance of a responsibility she intended to discharge correctly. She organized the deliberations methodically, making sure every juror had the opportunity to speak, and every piece of evidence received proper consideration, because the verdict they reached had to be right not just in outcome but in process. On the first afternoon, they discussed the forensic evidence. On the second morning, they reviewed the expert testimony. They asked the court for clarification on 2 points of law, one regarding the standard of proof, one regarding the specific charges, and Judge Harmon provided written responses to both with her characteristic precision. Then, on Thursday afternoon, at 3:17, Barbara Hollies looked around the table at 11 faces that reflected back the same expression hers wore, the expression of people who have done the work, completed the process, and arrived at the only destination the evidence pointed toward, and she said, quietly, "I think we're ready." They were. The courtroom reassembled with the same charged atmosphere that had characterized every session of this trial, amplified now by the specific electricity of a verdict about to be delivered. The gallery filled in 7 minutes. Reporters who had been waiting in the corridor outside came in quickly and found their seats. The child welfare advocate from Cincinnati, who had driven back for the verdict, stood again along the right wall with her arms folded. Linda Marsh sat at the prosecution table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, a physical discipline she had developed over years of verdict moments, pressing her palms down so they couldn't betray her with trembling. Gerald Foss sat at the defense table with his client beside him, his posture correct and his expression professionally composed. Whatever he felt in the interior spaces of himself, and he felt things, because despite everything he was a human being doing a difficult job in a difficult system. None of it was visible. Judge Harmon entered, the room rose and settled. The jury filed in. Barbara Hollies carried the verdict form in both hands, holding it with a care that was both practical and somehow ceremonial, the way you carry something that represents more than its physical weight. She did not look at the defense table. She did not look at Linda Marsh. She looked at Judge Harmon as she took her seat, and the judge looked back at her with the same calm, measuring attention she brought to everything. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harmon asked. "We have, Your Honor," Barbara Hollies said. The bailiff carried the verdict form from the jury box to the judge's bench. Judge Harmon reviewed it in silence, reading carefully, completely, with no readable expression, and then returned it to the bailiff, who carried it back to Barbara. The room held every breath it contained. "On the first count," Barbara Hollies said, her voice steady and clear, "we the jury find the defendant guilty." The word landed. It landed the way significant words always land in courtrooms, not with drama, not with noise, but with a kind of finality that is almost physical, a before and after quality that divides time into what came before the word was spoken and what comes after. Guilty on the first count. Guilty on the second. Guilty on the third and fourth and fifth, each count read in the same steady voice, each verdict landing in the same deliberate silence. The defendant stared at the table in front of him. He had shown almost no emotion throughout the trial, a carefully maintained blankness that his attorney had no doubt counseled him toward, the strategic absence of reaction that defense attorneys recommend when they know their client will be watched by a jury for any sign that confirms what the evidence suggests. He maintained that blankness now, through all 5 counts, staring at the table with the fixed attention of someone who has decided that the table is the safest thing in the room to look at. Linda Marsh kept her hands pressed flat on the table. She looked at the verdict form. She looked at the jury. She looked at Barbara Hollies, who had set the form down and folded her hands and was looking straight ahead with the expression of someone who has done something hard and done it right and knows it. Linda did not cry. She had made a decision many years ago that she would not cry in courtrooms, and she had kept that decision through 15 years and more difficult verdicts than she could count. But something happened in her chest in that moment, a release of something that had been held tightly for a very long time, something that had been held since the morning she first read Emma Calloway's case file and understood what she was going to have to do and whether she was going to be able to do it. It released now. She breathed. Emma was not in the courthouse when the verdict came down. She was at Diane's house, sitting at the kitchen table with a box of crayons and a stack of white paper, working on something with the intense, absorbed concentration that young children bring to creative work, the total investment of the whole self in the making of a thing. Mr. Buttons was asleep on the radiator. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window in long golden rectangles that fell across the table and Emma's hands and the paper she was drawing on. Diane was at the counter making dinner, keeping the radio low. When her phone buzzed with a text from Carol Simmons, 2 words, all caps, followed by a single exclamation mark, she set down the wooden spoon she was holding and stood very still for a moment with her back to Emma. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. She breathed through her nose slowly twice. Then she turned around and looked at the little girl at her kitchen table, bent over her drawing with complete absorption, entirely unaware that 3 miles away in a courthouse on Mound Street, the system had just worked the way it was supposed to work, the way it didn't always work, the way you couldn't take for granted that it would work, but the way it had worked today, for this child, because a little girl had found her voice in a hallway and carried it into a courtroom and spoken plainly. Diane didn't say anything about the verdict. Emma was 3 years old. The verdict, in the way that verdicts are things, legal outcomes, sentencing hearings, the machinery of consequence, was not yet something Emma could hold. There would be time later with the right people and the right words to help her understand what had happened and what it meant. For now, Diane walked to the table and sat down across from Emma and looked at what she was drawing. It was a dog A large golden dog with enormous ears, slightly lopsided, the way things are when you draw them with genuine feeling rather than technical precision, and a smile that took up most of its face. Beside the dog, small and careful, was a girl with a yellow ribbon in her hair. "Who's that?" Diane asked softly, pointing to the girl. Emma looked up. "That's me," she said simply. Then she pointed to the dog, "And that's Justice." She picked up the gold crayon and went back to work. The story left the courthouse on Thursday evening and traveled fast. By Friday morning, it had appeared in the Columbus Dispatch. By Friday afternoon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press and redistributed to outlets across the country. By Saturday, it had been shared tens of thousands of times across social media platforms, passed between child welfare advocates and legal professionals and ordinary people who read it, and felt something shift in them that they might not have been able to articulate precisely. But that had to do, at its core, with the persistent human need to be reminded that the world contains more grace than it sometimes appears to. The legal conversation that followed was substantive and sustained. At the time of the trial, 23 states had explicit statutory or court rule authorization for facility dogs during testimony. The remaining 27 existed in varying degrees of legal ambiguity, some with informal programs operating at individual judges' discretion, some with no programs at all, some with programs that had been proposed and stalled in legislative committees for years without reaching a floor vote. The Columbus case moved things. 4 states introduced new legislation within 60 days of the verdict. 2 of those bills passed within the year, one in a state that had been debating the issue for nearly a decade without resolution, the bill's sponsor citing the Emma Calloway case specifically in her floor remarks. Child advocacy organizations that had been operating courthouse dog programs quietly and often precariously, dependent on individual judicial tolerance rather than clear legal protection, found themselves suddenly with more institutional support, more funding inquiries, more calls from prosecutors and judges wanting to understand how to implement what Columbus had demonstrated was possible. Dr. Renee Foster was invited to testify before a state Senate Judiciary Committee 6 weeks after the verdict. She brought research. She brought data. She brought the clinical language of cortisol levels and neurological regulation and trauma-informed practice. And she brought, at the end of her prepared remarks, the story of a 3-year-old girl on a courthouse floor talking to a golden dog about a rabbit with blue stitching. Because sometimes the data needs a face, and sometimes the face needs to be 3 years old and wearing a white dress with blue flowers and buckled shoes with one buckle slightly off-center. The committee listened. Justice, unaware of all of it, went back to work on Friday morning. He had a victim interview at 9, a deposition at 11, a teenager on Monday who had been carrying something terrible inside him for 4 months and hadn't yet found a way to set it down. He was ready. He was always ready. That was, in the end, the whole of it, the simple, extraordinary, irreducible fact at the center of everything the Columbus case had stirred up and set in motion. A dog who showed up, a dog who paid attention, a dog who asked nothing and gave everything and made it possible, in room after room and case after case, for frightened human beings to find the thing inside themselves that fear had buried. The voice. Always the voice. It was there, it was always there. Justice just helped people find it. 6 weeks after the verdict, on a quiet Wednesday morning in late November, a pale yellow envelope arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse. It had been hand-delivered, not mailed, not sent through any official channel but carried in person by Diane, Emma's foster mother, who had driven downtown specifically to bring it, and had asked the front desk clerk, with careful politeness, if she could leave it for Officer Daniel Prout. The clerk had said yes and placed it in the internal mail tray, and it had made its way through the building's quiet circulation system until it arrived on Prout's desk sometime around 10 o'clock. Sitting on top of a stack of case preparation files like something that had always been there and was simply waiting to be noticed. Prout noticed it immediately. Not because it was large, it was small, the size of a greeting card envelope, And not because it was official looking, because it was the opposite of official looking. It was pale yellow and slightly wrinkled at one corner, as though it had been carried in a pocket or a small hand for some time before it arrived here. His name was written on the front in the oversized, effortful, deeply earnest letters of a child who is still learning that writing is a permanent act, that the marks you press into paper stay there, that they mean something, that they are a way of reaching across distance and saying I was here and I thought of you. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands once, the way you handle something you already know is going to matter before you've opened it. Then he slid his finger carefully under the flap and opened it slowly, the way you open things you don't want to damage. Inside was a single piece of paper, white, lined, torn carefully from a notebook. It had been folded twice into a neat rectangle, and when Prout unfolded it, the drawing was there. He sat with it in his hands for a long time. It was done entirely in crayon, the particular crayon work of a 3-year-old who draws with her whole arm rather than just her fingers, pressing hard enough that the colors were vivid and slightly waxy, leaving behind that specific texture that crayon on paper produces when a child puts real effort into it. The gold crayon had been pressed so firmly in places that it had a faint shine. 2 figures occupied the center of the page. The larger figure was unmistakably a dog, golden, with 4 sturdy legs and a tail that curved upward in a cheerful arc and ears that were the drawing's most prominent and most lovingly rendered feature, large and slightly lopsided, taking up a disproportionate amount of the figure's head in the way that children draw the things they find most important larger than everything else. The dog was smiling. It was a large, uncomplicated, full-face smile of the kind that exists more readily in children's drawings than in actual life. And it was the smile of something that was exactly where it was supposed to be and knew it. Beside the dog, rendered in slightly smaller scale but with equal care, was a girl. She had a yellow ribbon in her hair, a single curved line of yellow crayon above a round face with 2 dots for eyes and a small curved mouth. She was wearing a white dress. In her left hand she held a small brown rectangle that was, unmistakably, a rabbit. Her right hand was extended toward the dog, just touching, the tip of one enormous lopsided ear. They were sitting together. Just sitting, side by side on what appeared to be a floor, indicated by a single horizontal brown line beneath them, in a room that had no other details, no walls, no furniture, no people. Just the 2 of them in a space that the drawing seemed to understand needed nothing else. Below the figures, in the careful, tilting, deeply concentrated print of a child who has spent real time on each letter, who has understood, at some wordless level, that these particular words deserve to be gotten right, were 5 words. For Justy's thank you, Emma. Prout sat at his desk without moving for a long time. The case preparation files remained unstacked beside him. His coffee cooled. Through the small window of his office, the November sky was the particular flat gray of late autumn in Ohio. No drama, no weather, just the steady, settled grayness of a season that has made its peace with the cold. He was not a man given to displays of emotion. 15 years in law enforcement had not hardened him. He was careful about that, careful not to let the work build the particular callus that it sometimes built in people who did it long enough. The callus that protected you from being hurt, but also, eventually, protected you from being moved. He had stayed movable on purpose. He had decided early in his career that staying movable was part of the job, maybe the most important part. That a handler who could no longer be reached by the things his dog helped people carry was a handler who had lost the point of what they were doing. But he was not a man who cried at his desk. He was very close, right now, to being that man. He set the drawing down in front of him and looked at it. The lopsided ears, the yellow ribbon, the 5 carefully printed words with the spelling mistake that made them more perfect than correct spelling ever could have. Justy's. As though the word itself needed to be softer, needed the hard C replaced with something gentler, because the thing it named was gentle. He thought about the hallway. He thought about a small girl on a courthouse floor talking about velvet ears and strawberry ice cream, and an orange cat named Mr. Buttons. He thought about 12 steps across a courtroom floor, and a hand reaching down without looking for something it trusted would be there. He thought about one word, "hi," landing in a suspended silence like a stone in still water. He thought about what it meant to show up, to simply, consistently, without drama or recognition or any guarantee that it would matter, show up, to walk into the hard rooms and stay, to ask nothing and give everything and trust that presence by itself was sometimes the whole of what was needed. Justice, lying in his usual spot in the corner of the office, lifted his head and looked at Prout with those warm, honey-colored eyes. Prout looked back at him. "You got mail," he said quietly. Justice regarded him for a moment with the patient, attentive expression he brought to everything. Then he set his chin back on his paws. Prout picked up the drawing, walked to the wall beside his desk, and held it up next to Justice's first official courthouse ID photo. The one taken on their first day together 18 months ago, Justice sitting straight and serious in his blue vest, looking at the camera with the focused dignity of someone beginning something important. He found a thumbtack. He pressed it through the pale yellow paper carefully, at the very top edge so it didn't damage the drawing, and stepped back. The two images side by side, the official photograph and the crayon drawing, looked right together in a way that was difficult to explain but immediately apparent. The photograph said what justice was. The drawing said what justice meant. And the distance between those two things, between the official record and the felt truth, was exactly the distance that mattered most and was hardest to measure. Emma Calloway was placed permanently with Diane's family in the spring. The paperwork that made it official took 4 months to process. 4 months of home studies and court hearings and bureaucratic procedures that moved at the unhurried pace of systems, managing large and complicated responsibilities. But the outcome had never really been in doubt, because Diane had known from the 3rd week, and Emma had known in whatever way a child knows the things that matter most, not through understanding them but through feeling them, in the particular safety of a house where the lights were left on, and the cat slept on the radiator, and someone braided your hair every morning even when you didn't say thank you. Her preschool teacher, a young woman named Ms. Andrea, called Diane in April to report something she thought Diane would want to know. During free play that afternoon, Ms. Andrea said, Emma had arranged 7 stuffed animals in a row on the classroom carpet, bears and rabbits and a small plush elephant, and had stood in front of them with her hands clasped behind her back and her posture very straight, and spoken to them in a serious, clear voice. She had told them that sometimes things were scary. She had told them that being scared was okay because being scared didn't mean you couldn't do the thing anyway. She had told them that sometimes someone would come and sit with you and they wouldn't ask you for anything and that would help. And then she had walked down the row and patted each stuffed animal carefully on the head, the bears and the rabbits and the small plush elephant, and told them that their ears were soft and that soft was good. Ms. Andrea had watched from across the room without interrupting. When Emma finished, she picked up the plush elephant, tucked it under her arm, and went to the art table and began drawing something in gold crayon. Justice never knew. He never knew about the legislation or the journal articles or the Senate testimony or the 4 states that changed their laws in the year after the verdict. He never knew that his photograph had appeared in newspapers from Maine to Oregon, or that his story had been told in courtrooms and conference rooms and legislative chambers by people fighting to give other frightened children what Emma had been given. He never knew that a woman in Cincinnati had framed a printout of the Columbus Dispatch article and hung it on the wall of her courthouse dog program office, or that a prosecutor in Nashville had cited Emma's case in a brief that helped establish Tennessee's first formal facility dog policy. He knew the hallway. He knew the courtroom. He knew the smell of fear and the weight of a small hand and the particular way that breathing changed when a person who had been held closed by terror began, slowly and carefully, to open. He knew his job. And every morning, without fail, without hesitation, without any apparent awareness that what he was doing was extraordinary, he did it. On a cold Monday morning in December, 3 months after the verdict and 6 weeks after a pale yellow envelope arrived on a desk in a small office on the 2nd floor, Officer Daniel Prout clipped Justice's blue vest into place, checked the badge, and opened the door. Justice walked through it without pausing. Down the corridor, past the security desk where the guards called him by name, into the elevator, up to the second floor, down the marble hallway where the morning light came in cold and clear through the high windows and fell in long pale rectangles across the polished floor. Somewhere in the building, behind a closed door, someone was sitting alone with their fear. Someone was gripping something tightly, a stuffed animal, a jacket sleeve, their own hands, and wondering if they could do what was being asked of them. Wondering if the voice that fear had buried was still there. Wondering if, when the moment came, they would be able to find it. Justice turned the corner. His ears moved forward, that attentive, certain tilt that Prude had learned to read as the dog saying, quietly and without drama, "I see them. I've got this." He walked down the hallway with his steady, unhurried stride. He was going to find them. He always did.